Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over an EDH deck that I've recently built around Phylath, World Sculptor, a commander from Zendikar Rising. I found the idea of building a deck with an abnormally large amount of basic lands rather fun, and had originally aimed to have as much land as possible in this deck, which settled at about half the deck being basic lands. As usual, this deck was built to cost under $45 using prices listed by Scryfall. It includes the cost of basic lands at 10 cents a piece, but it is not including the cost of shipping. The deck list will be, for the time being, in my channel's About page, as YouTube still hasn't determined that I'm a real person behind the mic, but once they release me, I'll put the deck list for this and all my other videos into the respective descriptions. Anyway, let's dive into the deck. So, Phylath, World Sculptor, is a 5/5 legendary elemental who costs 4 generic and Gruul colors, and reads, when Phylath enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each basic land you control. Additionally, it has Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put 4 +1/+1 counters on a target plant you control. So our aim with this deck is to ramp using almost entirely basic lands, so that we can get Phylath out as quickly as possible, while making as many plant tokens as possible with Phylath's ETB effect. Then with Phylath out, we'll be using these land drops to buff all of the plants we just put on the field. As such, much of this deck is focused on spells that either let us tutor out basic lands directly onto the battlefield, or let us play multiple lands during a turn. As we'll have huge tracts of land for mana later into the game, we'll make use of some X mana cost spells to either get some huge creatures on the board, or play sorceries with huge impact. So let's start with the spells that'll let us get Phylath out before turn 6. To begin, we have some low to the ground creatures such as Elvish Pioneer, Steve, also known as Sakura Tribe Elder, and Burnished Heart. Elvish Pioneer lets you play an additional basic land from your hand when it ETBs, and then Steve and Burnished Heart can be sacrificed, letting you search your library for basic lands that enter the battlefield tapped. We also have Azusa's Many Journeys, a saga that, on the first turn it's played, lets you play an additional land. On the second turn it gives you 3 life, and then on the third turn, you exile it, and it returns as Likeness of the Seeker, an enchantment creature that lets you untap 3 basic lands if it ever becomes blocked. We also have Wayfarer's Bauble, which is an artifact for 1 that, if you pay 2, tap and sack it, it lets you search your library for a basic land that enters the battlefield tapped. We also have Font of Fertility, which is basically a green enchantment version of Wayfarer's Bauble, and Rampant Growth, which is a sorcery which does similar to Font of Fertility and Wayfarer's Bauble. We also have Enter the Unknown and Explore, both of which let you play an additional land on the turn that you play them. Enter the Unknown additionally lets a target creature you control explore, which basically means you reveal the top card of your library, and you put that card into your hand if it's a land card. Otherwise, you put a +1/+1 counter on the creature, and either put the card back on top of your library, or you put it into your graveyard. Next up, we have Kodama's Reach and Cultivate, 2 cards that are effectively reskins of each other, and they let you search your library for 2 basic land cards. You reveal them, and then put 1 onto the battlefield tapped, and then the other into your hand. We also have cards like Explosive Vegetation, Path of the Animist, and Migration Path, all of which cost 3 generic and a green, and let you search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, which then enter the battlefield tapped. Now for some consistent additional land drops, we can use cards like Druid Class, Mina and Den, Wildborn, and Oracle of Moldiah. Druid Class is an enchantment that can be leveled up by adding additional mana to it while it's on the field. And in particular, we're interested in level 2 for Druid Class, which, for 2 generic and a green, makes it so that we can play an additional land on each of our turns, so long as the enchantment remains under our control. Mina and Den have a static ability letting us play an additional land on each of our turns, and Oracle of Moldiah also lets us play an additional land on each of our turns. However, it also has us play with the top card of our library revealed, and if the top card of our library is a land, we can play that card. And finally, for land ramp, we have Adelan Jackal, which is a card from the Warhammer set, and has Trample and Haste, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may search your library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Now that we can get a bunch of lands onto the battlefield quickly, let's try and get some triggers off those land drops. First up, we have Tunneling Geopede, which deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever a land ETB is under our control. Roaring Earth, which lets us put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature or vehicle we control whenever a land ETB is under our control. Retreat to Kazandu, which gives us the option to either put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature or gain 2 life whenever we have a land drop. Evolution Sage, which lets us proliferate whenever we have a land ETB under our control. Seer Sundial, which lets us draw a card if we pay 2 when a land ETB is under our control. Tireless Tracker, which lets us investigate whenever a land ETB is under our control, meaning we create a clue token that can be sacrificed for the cost of 2 mana to draw a card. And additionally, it gets a +1/+1 counter whenever we sacrifice a clue token. There's also Rampaging Baloths, which is a 6/6 trampler letting us make a 4/4 green beast creature token whenever a land ETB is under our control. And finally, we have Avenger of Zendikar, which is actually quite similar to Phylath itself, which, when Avenger of Zendikar enters the battlefield, we put a 0/1 green plant creature token onto the battlefield for each land we control. And additionally, whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we can put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature we control. Now let's talk about some additional ways that we can buff our creatures. First up, we have Haunted Cloak, an equipment that gives its creature Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. We also have Blackblade Reforged, which can be incredible in land decks like this, and is a legendary equipment that gives its equipped creature +1/+1 for each land we control, and it only costs 3 to equip if we put it to a legendary creature. This can make Phylath incredibly scary considering how many lands we're expecting to throw down onto the field. We also have Loyal Guardian, which is a 4/4 trampler with Lieutenant, which lets us put a +1/+1 counter on each of our creatures at the beginning of our combat phase, provided we control our commander. We also have The Crowd Goes Wild, which is a sorcery that costs X and green, and has support X, which lets us put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to X target creatures. Additionally, each creature with a +1/+1 counter on it gains trample until the end of the turn. And finally, we have Overrun, which is a sorcery that gives creatures we control +3/+3 and trample until the end of the turn. Now the way this deck functions can leave us with an empty hand quite quickly sometimes, so we're going to need to find ways to either refill or replace our hand. First up, we have Deepwood Denizen, which can be tapped for 5 and a green to draw a card. However, this ability costs 1 less to activate for each +1/+1 counter we have on creatures we control, so as long as we can get 1 Phylath Landfall trigger off, this will only cost 1 and a green, and beyond that, it will only cost 1 green. We also have Arcane Encyclopedia, which for 3 mana can be tapped to draw a card. Loreseeker Stone, which lets us draw 3 cards for 3 mana if we have no cards in our hand, however this ability costs 1 more to cast for each card in our hand. Colossal Majesty, which lets us draw a card at the beginning of our upkeep provided we have a creature with power 4 or greater, which we will frequently have between Phylath and the buffed plants. And we also have Harmonize, which simply lets us draw 3 cards. Sometimes we'll also want to cycle our hands, as this deck has a heavy focus on land, and frequently you'll end up having just a handful of land. Given we have access to red, that means we have access to a good number of wheel effects. First up we have Chandra, Flamecaller, which is a legendary planeswalker with 4 starting loyalty, and a few different effects. However, the most important for us is the 0 loyalty effect, letting us discard the cards in our hand, and then drawing that many cards +1. And for full-on wheel effects, we have Magus of the Wheel and Wheel of Fate. For 1 generic and a red, Magus of the Wheel can be tapped and sacked for a wheel effect, making each player discard their hand and then draw 7 cards. Wheel of Fate has to spend 4 for 1 and a red mana, meaning that the effect will happen 4 turns after you cast the effect, provided nobody proliferates the counter on it. And it also does a wheel effect, making each player discard their hand and then draw 7 cards. Now coming into the later stages of the game, you can expect to have a lot of mana available given our focus on additional land drops, and we can make great use of that mana with spells that have X in their casting cost. This includes creatures like Hungering Hydra, Apocalypse Hydra, and Polykranos, World Eater. Hungering Hydra and Apocalypse Hydra enter with X +1/+1 counters on them. Hungering Hydra also can't be blocked by more than 1 creature, and when damage is dealt to it, it gains that many +1/+1 counters. And Apocalypse Hydra has the additional effect where, if X is 5 or greater, it ETBs with twice as many +1/+1 counters as it normally would. And for 1 generic and a red, you can remove a +1/+1 counter from the Apocalypse Hydra to ping any target for 1 damage. And while Polykranos doesn't have X in its casting cost, it has Monstrosity X for XX in green. And when Polykranos becomes monstrous, it deals X damage divided as you choose amongst target creatures' opponent's control, and then those creatures deal damage equal to their power to Polykranos. We also have X-cost sorceries such as Clan Defiance, Red Sun Zenith, and Jaya's Immolating Inferno. Clan Defiance lets us choose any number of its effects, which include dealing X damage to target creature with flying, dealing X damage to target creature without flying, and dealing X damage to target player. Red Sun Zenith deals X damage to target creature or player, and if a creature would be put into a graveyard from the spell, it gets exiled instead. Additionally, Red Sun Zenith gets shuffled back into its owner's library instead of being put into its graveyard. And Jaya's Immolating Inferno deals X damage to up to 3 targets, though it is good to note that this is a legendary sorcery, meaning you do have to have a legendary creature or planeswalker on the field in order to play this card. And finally, for our mana dump cards, we have Animus Awakening, which has us reveal the top X cards of our library and put all the land cards from among them onto the battlefield tapped and the rest onto the bottom of our library in a random order. Additionally, it has Spell Mastery, meaning if you have 2 or more instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard, you get to untap the lands that are entering the battlefield due to Animus Awakening. Provided that X is a relatively large number, this can lead to a lot of landfall triggers happening at once. And even if you only had Phylath out, you're going to be putting a lot of +1/+1 counters onto your plants at minimum. Now, before I get to the lands, there's a couple extra cards that I'd like to talk about, and these are Decimate and Primal Order. For 2 and a Gruul, Decimate lets us destroy a lot of things, including a target artifact, creature, enchantment, and land. So an overall pretty solid interaction spell. And Primal Order makes it so at the beginning of each player's upkeep, Primal Order deals damage to that player equal to the number of non-basic lands that they control. Given the prevalence of non-basic lands throughout Commander, and the fact that this deck is almost entirely filled with basic lands for its land base, this card can deal a lot of damage to our opponents while literally doing nothing to us. And now very quickly, let's go over our lands, of which there's only 1 non-basic land in this deck, which is Myriad Landscape, which enters the battlefield tapped and lets you tap to add 1 generic mana. But the reason why this card is in this deck is, for 2 and tapping, you can sacrifice Myriad Landscape and search your library for up to 2 basic land cards that share the same land type and put them onto the battlefield tapped. So this is a form of land ramp. And, as promised, the remaining half of this deck is filled with basic lands. We will be using 25 forests and 25 mountains, as color fixing is not a huge issue in this deck. Now let's look at the price tag. And as you can see here, Phylath World Sculptor comes in just under $45. Again, this includes the cost of basic lands at 10 cents a piece, but does not include the cost of shipping. If you'd like to build, play with, or adapt this deck, the link for the deck will be in my channel's About page for the time being. And once YouTube determines I'm actually a real human being behind the mic, the link will be put in the description down below. If you liked what you watched, consider giving the video a like. If you'd like more budget Commander decks, consider dropping a subscription to the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.